constructed. A short distance away is the other mound, the one which carries the present castle. What is certain about both these huge mounds is that they were man-made. As I said, the chalk downs don't naturally produce shapes like these. The mounds were made of roughly shaped blocks of chalk which all had to be hauled up. That's what they are under all this vegetation. It is squared chalk. Both of them had on the top a more or less circular shell keep, and the higher of the two still has. The stone is flint. The two projecting towers, which much improved the skyline, were a 13th century addition. But by the mid-14th century the castle had already fallen into disuse, and in 1621, that is before the Civil War, it was dismantled. In the 18th century, the keep was regarded as a sort of super gazebo or summer house by the people at Barbican House just below who leased it. And the principal reason for climbing up here is still to enjoy the view. Much the most impressive surviving part of the castle architecturally is the Barbican, which was built in front of the Norman gatehouse. This was only a generation or so before the castle was abandoned. It's one of the biggest and best examples we have of this kind of outer gatehouse. The flint work here is much more refined than on the keep. The flints are carefully knapped, split that is, and laid in fairly regular courses, a decidedly early example of this technique. And for the machicolations, the overhanging battlements, they even brought up some green sandstone from the Weald. They used this stone for the dressings too. The cross-shaped arrow loops, the bases of the bartizans or projecting turrets, and the archway. As we can see, the sandstone hasn't weathered nearly as well as these virtually indestructible flints. So here at Lewes, flint work spans the centuries and turns up in many different guises. Here it is in Kerr Street, well known also for its cobblestones. George IV, when Prince of Wales, is said to have driven a coach down this precipitous hill for a wager. He was always short of cash. These strangely shaped stones, needless to say, are also mainly flints. The local people call them petrified kidneys. As they look water-rolled, they probably came from the beach at Newhaven, after the opening of the lower Ouse navigation at the end of the 18th century. An Act of 1806 provided for the cleansing and paving of the streets of this town, and that's when these kidneys were probably brought in. At the bottom of the hill, there's a good view of the town walls. Flint again, although now coursed at intervals with brick. This stretch goes back to 1269. These Georgian houses in the High Street, next door to each other, provide an object lesson in differing methods of flint construction. At 139, pretty crude, even though most of them are knapped. at 140. Still not very good, but at least they're coursed. But here at 141, coursed, napped and squared. A really beautiful piece of craftsmanship. Very enjoyable too is this little early 19th century house front down the hill in Sun Street. For this they obviously went to the beach at Newhaven or Seaford and picked out a whole lot of flint cobbles worn by the action of the sea into large eggs. These were carefully laid in courses, and for the dressings they used brick, here painted green, as a foil to the cobbles. They went to a lot of trouble, you see, but it was immensely worth it. Brick was quite often employed to provide dressings for flint in the 18th and 19th centuries. At St. Michael's Court in Kerr Street, which was built in 1846 as an almshouse, white brick was used, to good effect, I feel. Whereas here, at the former Baptist Chapel in Southover, a much earlier building, red brick dressings set off the napped flints. Apart from flint, stone at Lewes is exceptional, certainly for houses. But there is one important Elizabethan example, Southover Grange. This charming house, which now belongs to the town, was built of cornerstone imported from Normandy for the Prior's Lodge of St. Pancras Priory, which was demolished accidentally in a fire in 1568. The roof also is partly of stone. Look at those great slabs of Wealden sandstone. They're known generically as Horsham slates, although, like Aylesbury ducks and Norfolk turkeys, they're found in a good many other places too. These sandstone slates adorn, and that is certainly the word, a number of other buildings in Lewes. The Church of St. Thomas of Canterbury at Cliffe has some of the best examples. The way in which on all these roofs the slates are carefully graded from sometimes as much as 2 feet at the base to no more than a few inches at the ridge is an unfailing source of pleasure. In the 18th century, when, as we shall see, Lewes was at the peak of its prosperity, a little stone did come from further afield, always of course by sea. Portland stone had first appeared in this town in 1812, when it was employed to face the new county hall. This is a building with a very distinct personality of its own. In the 3 panels above the central windows are reliefs of mercy, wisdom, and justice. These are in code stone, which was a kind of terracotta. It has proved extremely durable, but the secret of its manufacture was closely guarded and has been lost. This is no longer the county hall. Together with Newcastle House next door, it's now part of the law courts. Newcastle House also has a Portland stone front. But the present building has only been here since 1928. The original house on this site was faced with Carl stone brought in barges from Normandy. Until the turn of this century, Lewes was quite a busy port. It was only about 8 miles upriver from Newhaven. It's not therefore altogether surprising that we should find 1 or 2 unexpected materials here, especially on buildings close to the river. These pretty hung slates in the form of scallops were brought, I should say, in the early years of the 19th century from Devon or Cornwall. If you think the materials at the side of this house are slates, though, you've been taken in, as the builders fully intended that you should be. They're replacements, no more than 10 years old, in asbestos. They succeed surprisingly well. There are also one or two slate roofs here, and more hung slates painted white. Deceptively enough, however, these houses, like many others in the area, are all timber-framed. And my goodness, don't these people love their television? In the Middle Ages, Sussex abounded in wood, and in oaks in particular. And almost every house in Lewes, as in so many other English towns, had its timber frame. This is a 15th century example. But for centuries, the timbers were hidden under a coat of plaster and only revealed again in the early years of the present century. The milestone incorporated in the wall came from a building opposite, now demolished. These two buildings provide a nice contrast. Both, we notice, are jetted, which means that the upper floor overhangs, but one has a curved cove underneath the jetty, while the other one has a feature of great historical interest, a blocked traceried window which undoubtedly takes us back to the 14th century. Shingles, wooden tiles, are always renewed. They must be, because they never last as much as a century, and sometimes a good deal less. You hardly see them now except on church spires, but there are plenty of those in the southeast of England, and Lewes, in fact, has two. St Anne's, which is the best of what I'm bound to say is a not very distinguished brood of churches, has a low flint tower crowned by a shingled spire. The shingles are almost certainly machine-sawn Canadian cedar wood. You can't get oak shingles anymore, and in some ways the cedar wood is anyway more practical, as well as being a lot less expensive. St Michael's, in the High Street, has a warped but pretty little shingled spire surmounting a round tower, built presumably of flint, which has been well nigh ruined by being smothered with pebble dash. A quite lamentable treatment. If water was seeping in, the right course, despite the higher cost, was to renew the mortar. Lewes wasn't particularly prosperous in medieval times. It has never at any time had very much industry, although, as we saw, it was a port. But from the last quarter of the 17th century, it began to prosper as an administrative and social centre. It was, after all, the county town of Sussex. Some people built new houses. Others had to be content with fitting up their timber-framed houses with smart new fronts. In the Georgian period, timber framing was regarded as almost unbearably old-fashioned. And so, in order to mask it, we come to Lewes's most original building material, the brick tile, or mathematical tile, as it's more usually called. I've never been able to understand why. These tiles were widely used in the southeast, though hardly at all anywhere else. They're not by any means peculiar to Lewes, and indeed they appear earlier in other places. But there's probably no other English town which has so many of them. Over 60 houses, wholly or partly faced with mathematical tiles. In the 18th century, they were the Lewes speciality. Now, what exactly were they? I'll take a long bet that most of you have never seen one, at any rate knowingly. Well, this is what they looked like. And they were hung vertically, like this. Now, being much lighter than brick, these tiles were a convenient way of giving your timber-framed house a brick look without rebuilding. The better they are, of course, the more difficult they are to detect. They were intended to look just like bricks, and at best they do. Originally, they had nothing to do with the avoidance of the brick tax of 1784, since some go back to the 1740s, and a great many of them antedate it. Incidentally, this house originally had a gabled roof, and you can see that the top story is a later addition from the way that the downpipes stop well short of the new roof. The black tiles came in rather later than the red, around about 1780. Their surface was always glazed, and this was achieved by coating the surface of the tile with a lead-based mixture before filing. Needless to say, they were always very weather resistant. It's very instructive to see how these tiles were attached. The usual method was to fix boards horizontally over the timber framing of the house. Then the tiles were nailed to the boards. And bedded in lime putty, rather like this. You'll have to forgive my chronic lack of expertise as a craftsman. Well, that's the sort of idea. An excellent example of black mathematicals is the front of Bartholomew House, just below the castle. This is an early 19th century building and also timber-framed. First, notice the odd arrangement of the windows. One would never design window openings in this sort of relationship with the corners so nearly touching if the material were brick. Nor do the window heads have anything suggestive of arches, another telltale. Now look at the angle. With mathematical tiles, corners were always the problem. You could, of course, have special angle tiles made, but they were expensive. Most people may do with thin wooden battens, like this. But here, as we see, the lowest section is missing, and that enables us to see how the tiles go. Plenty of lime putty, you see, to hold them firm. Other things sometimes go wrong. They develop bulges, or some of them start to slip, as here. That's when the detection of brick tiles becomes quite easy. Another frequent telltale is when the house appears to have coins of stone, which turn out on examination to be nothing more than blocks of wood, as here. No town, except perhaps Brighton, 8 miles away, has so many black brick tiles as Lewes. It's no doubt largely a matter of fashion. When the sun catches them, they are very responsive to reflections, At Brighton, facing the sea, I've seen them looking positively blue, which is not, alas, what is happening here today. With black glazed tiles, the bond always consists entirely of headers, and very effective they are. This is often the case with the red mathematicals too, but there are exceptions, and this is one of them. A special feature of the charming little Friends meeting house, erected in 1784, is the use of black glaze mathematicals to surround the windows. Those forming the heads had, of course, to be produced specially, what is called purpose-made. As these windows all have their original white-painted glazing bars, the colour scheme is very effective. A generation later, red was completely out of fashion. But for a short time, white mathematical tiles were produced, as here. At least they were called white, but as with wines, the word is an elegant euphemism. I wonder why it is white is considered so much more elegant, so much more desirable than yellow. After 1850, brick tiles were much less used, but they still continued to be made nearby at Burgess Hill until 1960. The predilection for bow windows in Lewes may have something to do with the popularity of mathematical tiles. In the case of bows, like this one, the backing boards were fixed not horizontally, but vertically on a shallow curve. Structurally, the thinness of the tiles has an obvious advantage over brick. But it seems that bow windows were also liked for social, not to say snobbish, reasons. When a shopkeeper was doing so well that his wife no longer had to soil her hands by working, the bow window was just the place where she could sit and show herself and watch the busy world go by. Here, the mathematicals, for once, are all stretchers. The coins here, again, are not stone, but wood. In fact, despite every appearance to the contrary, this is yet another timber structure. Much more familiar than the mathematicals as a wall covering in the southeast are hung tiles, and Lewes has many good examples, mostly again over timber framing. Hung tiles were considered less urbane in the Georgian period than mathematical tiles or bricks, but on a good many Lewes houses one can find them both, juxtaposed as here. The obvious difference is that hung tiles overlap and cast attractive shadows. The vertical joints are sometimes filled with mortar, but in all the best examples they are left open to yield little shadows in addition to the stronger horizontal shadows cast by the overhangs, a delightfully subtle effect. Characteristic of some of the best examples are those variations of tint and of density which help to breathe vitality into a tile-hung wall. And because they hang vertically, they don't attract moss nor lichen, as roofs sometimes do. But whether on walls or roofs, they must be handmade to be wholly satisfying. Machine-made tiles look painfully mechanical and give no pleasure at all. The 18th century saw the building of many excellent houses in brick. This one, Morling House, just outside the town, is a specially fine example from the time of Queen Anne, though the roof here is still constructed of Wealden sandstone slates, and very imposing they look. The brickwork shows some delightful refinements. There are the gauged and moulded bricks over the windows and along the plat band, with their very fine jointing. And the red surrounds to the windows contrasted with the preponderance of grey bricks, all headers on the intervening walling. These greys are another Lewes speciality. These grey bricks were produced in kilns fired with coppice timber. It was the potash in the wood smoke that was responsible for the light grey facing. But to become vitrified or glazed, the bricks needed also to be in the hottest part of the kiln. And how good they look as a foil to the red dressings. But the facing was only skin deep, and sometimes it can be seen to have partly worn off. This is still more noticeable at School Hill House. Here, the craftsmanship of the brick above the first floor windows, with their pelmet-like effect, is highly accomplished. School Hill House is one of the most imposing Georgian buildings in Lewes. There's also some good red brick to be seen in the town. On this house, it makes a very pleasant contrast with the grey brick next door and the red mathematicals beyond. The so-called white brick of the first half of the 19th century isn't so common here, but Priory Crescent at Southover provides an imposing example. For this white brick, there had to be plenty of lime in the clay, and that presented no problem in this chalky area. Bricks were so easy to come by here that, in piped passage, they were even used to pave. Like many old towns, Lewes has kept a lot of little streets so narrow as to be for pedestrians only. These passages have many different names. Wines at Richmond in Yorkshire and in Edinburgh, lanes at Tewkesbury and at Carlisle, rows at Great Yarmouth as well as at Saffron Walden, scores at Lowestoft, and I've no doubt that there are others. But at Lewes, the name is the most engaging of any, Twittons. Corruption, I believe, of betwixt and between. But though in general Lewes can be described as a town which has had a long love affair with brick, and given the marvellous brick-making properties of the local clays, one can understand why, there is also quite a lot of stucco, mostly, I believe, dating from the first half of the 19th century. The White Hart is a timber-framed structure which was originally built as long ago as 1579, and later became a town house for the Pelham family. Needless to say, the handsome stucco front is a 19th century addition. Almost opposite is the interesting building known as Castle Place, designed in 1810 by Eamon Wildes. The special feature of this stucco-fronted house is the pair of pilasters crowned by most unusual capitals, with scrolls that take the form of ammonite fossils. Could this be a pun on the architect's name? Lewes still has some nice old shops, and here's an enjoyable sequence. Not all the bow windows are old, of course. And despite the date, this shop front only goes back to the early 19th century. But it is notable for its intricate wrought iron cornice with vine leaves. A few yards away is one of those pretty cast iron balconies produced locally about the same time by the Phoenix Ironworks. The gilt letters are also quite good, but what a place to put them. The most distinguished-looking shop is Elphick's, and that goes back to the 18th century, though the handsome colonnade of Tuscan Doric columns does consort somewhat uneasily with the typically Victorian frilly tile hanging above. Elphick's is in Cliff High Street, which may soon be made into a walkers-only street. I hope it will. Traders, like everyone else, would benefit. Also in Cliff is Harvey's Brewery. Brewing was a lively activity here in the 19th century, but this is one of the only two firms surviving from that period. In 1880, the original Georgian brewery was rebuilt, and its rather attractive Victorian tower, in red brick, now dominates the lower part of the town. Lewes, for me, has a twofold appeal. There's the old town itself, bestraddling its chalky crest and spilling down the slopes, with its incomparable legacy of flint, tiles, brick. And then there's the wonderful landscape setting, of which one never grows tired, with the clean lines of the hills silhouetted against the sky.